As a child of the 80s, ThunderCats was the absolute epitome of awesomeness to me. I just couldn't get enough of it. I had the toys, the bed covers, heck, I still even have the towel that made me the cool kid of school swimming trips. But the premise of a group of anthropomorphic cats who escape their exploding planet, crash land on a new world, and become friends and protectors of local inhabitants, defending them against a tyrannical Mum-Ra and his horde of evil minions, was just mind-blowing to my 6-year-old self. Of course, my unworldly child brain forbade me from realising what my cynical adult life exposed. That the show was really about an idiotic regal man-child who couldn't keep himself out of trouble for 5 seconds, as he's too stupid or arrogant to listen to the advice of anyone. So his team of other ThunderCats have to put down whatever they're doing and put their own lives at risk constantly to rescue him from his own sheer stupidity, all in the name of monarchical hierarchy. Why the ThunderCats didn't immediately dismiss royal lineage and become a democracy in a survival situation is beyond me. But hey, it's a kids' show. I'm not even going to go into the politics of how the hell they're expected to repopulate an entire species with only 3 females. Many of you younger viewers out there may be more familiar with the 2011 reboot of this series, which, as blasphemous to say as it is, in all honesty, is a vastly superior show. Well, except for the writers insisting on shipping all the main characters for some reason. But Lion-O's a more believable character this time around, growing up from a privileged child into an actual hero, rather than being an insufferable dipshit like he is in the original. Sadly, the 2011 version of ThunderCats only lasted 1 season, after Cartoon Network realised that people actually enjoyed the show, so promptly cancelled it. But when it came to the original ThunderCats video games, if you lived in the United States, you were pretty much out of luck. Which is surprising really, considering LJN had the merchandising rights to ThunderCats, yet never produced an NES game. Though, there is a reason why, but I'm going to make you squirm by not telling you until the end of the video. British gamers, however, were far more fortunate, as in 1987, Elite Systems, known more at the time for porting arcade games to home computers, suddenly announced they had obtained the rights to produce ThunderCats games, and would be released in time for that very Christmas. Released on the Amstrad CPC, Spectrum, Commodore 64, and later for the Atari ST and the Amiga, ThunderCats, The Lost Eye of Thundera, cast you in the main of the Lord of the ThunderCats himself, who is on a quest to rescue the rest of the ThunderCats who were inexplicably kidnapped by molemen, while at the same time also retrieve the Eye of Thundera, that glowy eye thing that's in his sword, after Mum-Ra nicked it, because the developers confused mummies with magpies. An easy mistake. Not that Lion-O really gives a crap, as the rescue of his friends is demoted to optional bonus levels, and according to Weapons Indicator on the 16-bit versions, he already has the Eye of Thundera in his possession. So his whole objective seems more a flimsy excuse just to give Mum-Ra a good kicking. The game is spread across 11 levels, 14 if you have a 16-bit machine or an 8-bit machine with 128k memory, all while the game throws an absolute shitload of enemies at your face. But fear not, as Lion-O is armed to the whiskers with an entire duo of non-canonical weapons in his arsenal. The 8-bit versions have Lion-O wield his sword like he's trying to chop down a tree, but for the 16-bitters, the Lord of the ThunderCats attacks with real half-hearted slashes, only swinging it half of the way, as if he's afraid of hurting his enemies. Which is kind of accurate, as he never actually stabbed anyone with his sword in the show, but show consistency goes completely out of the window later on as Lion-O gets a laser gun, which is a far better weapon as you can at least kill the midgets with it. Speaking of which, Mum-Ra's harrowing process of enemies seems rather moronic at best. The ever-living one seems more adamant on using the hardly ever seen in the show mole men, and a rather strange obsession with employing midgets, bats, and dive-bombing giant eyeballs. Maybe there's some sort of oppressive bad guy union on Third Earth, or Mum-Ra's just a decent equal opportunities guy at heart. However, it does seem bizarre that yet another game based on an 80s cartoon has very few villains from the show actually in it. In the 8-bit ports, Monkey does appear in the game as multiple generic enemies, but then he has equal billing as one of these bouncing Minotaurs which have never actually appeared at all in the series. Elite themselves must have twigged onto the lack of show's characters, as the later 16-bit ports also included Vultureman and Jackalman. Slythe is still a complete no-show though. But in all honesty, the only enemy from the show that actually portrays himself as a cast member, rather than a clone disposable enemy, is Mumra himself, who occasionally appears as a static sprite with his arms stretched out showing you the inside of his cloak, like he's a bleeding merchant from Resident Evil 4 or something. What you buying? But Mumra's more than happy to let you wail on him with your sword until he promptly sods off in a puff of smoke. In fact, his best form for attack seems to be screwing with the collision detection that kills you instantly. Dare you have the audacity to turn around and attack his flying asterisks of doom? But the general premise of ThunderCats is simple enough. Stages are made up of hacking and slashing away from left to right, or right to left, with the occasional vehicle section, where Lionel has to break his own spine in order to sit in the thing. Sadly, this variety isn't as fun as you might think, as that one-hit death still comes into play. You move so fast in that thing, you're normally dead before you even realise it. So after 14 levels, are you rewarded with an almighty final boss battle with Mumra that will finally restore peace throughout the world of Third Earth? Of course not, no. The game just ends with a static image of Lionel with a face like a smacked ass. When it came to reviews of ThunderCats at the time, magazines absolutely loved the game. Multi-format magazine Ace gave The Lost Eye of Thundera the completely ridiculous score of 931 out of 1,000. Mike of Spectrum magazine Crash said, "It's got weeks and weeks of playability just waiting to be used. I'm still trying to finish the bonus screen after level 2. Mike obviously being a complete idiot. Computer and Video Games gave the game 9 out of 10 and even stated they reckon that the game could even collect the same cult following as Ghosts and Goblins. And Sinclair User even went as far as to give the game the perfect score of 10 out of 10. Personally, I have absolutely no idea what the magazines were smoking at the time, as in all honesty, the game isn't that good. Certainly not 9 or 10 out of 10 good. The Lost Eye of Thundera is really an unfair hard game, not a fun hard game, which magazines back then completely dropped the ball on noticing. And it's really down to that sheer amount of enemies the game throws at you, with their random and rather unexpected placement throughout the game. So when you combine that with the extremely harsh time of forcing you to rush through the game, combined with such a small area in which to attack them with, both in distance and available attacking positions, you have a game that isn't really that well thought out. As with CVG's statement, the obvious comparison to this game is Ghosts and Goblins, which Elite themselves ported the year before. But as hard as that game is, you always had a projectile weapon to distance yourself from an onslaught of enemies, and enemies themselves were placed in specific locations, so you would never have to deal with concentrating on killing enemies and precision platforming at the same time. ThunderCats, however, completely ignores all those rules, and beating the game is more an attrition of luck rather than skill. ThunderCats is certainly a pretty looking game, especially the animation on the 8-bit versions, even giving the odd bit of parallax scrolling in some ports, something unheard of at the time. So it seems the reviewers of the day were more bedazzled by the graphics than the gameplay, as the game certainly doesn't deserve the scores it received. However, the most interesting thing about this whole game is ThunderCats The Lost Eye of Thundera was never actually meant to be a ThunderCats game at all. The reason why lies in Elite's promise to release the ThunderCats game in time for Christmas, or rather, a ThunderCats game. Elite were adamant about getting ThunderCats out in time for the holidays, so as a contingency plan, they developed not one, but 2 ThunderCats games. The first, which was supposed to be the actual ThunderCats game, was contracted out to the small development studio Paradise Software, and a backup game being developed in-house in case Paradise's version wasn't ready in time. However, with the December deadline coming up fast, it suddenly dawned on Elite that neither game would be ready in time. So out of desperation, they scoured other developers to see if they themselves had any near-completed titles of a similar style that they could use instead as an impromptu ThunderCats game. So during their search they came across Gargoyle Games. Well, more specifically Gargoyle Games subsidiary Faster Than Light, who were just about adding the finishing touches to a side-scrolling hack-and-slash game by the name of Samurai Dawn. Now, very little information actually exists about Samurai Dawn, other than 2 small preview articles about it being in development, as well as this single screenshot from an issue of CVG, which, as you can see, is pretty much conclusive that Samurai Dawn is the Lost Eye of Thundera, as they look to be the exact same game. So after a small amount of tinkering on the gameplay and doing a bit of the old Doki Doki Panic on the characters and enemies, Samurai Dawn became ThunderCats The Lost Eye of Thundera. So technically, Elite had developed not one, but 3 ThunderCats games. Many magazines at the time had caught cross wires on this information and proclaimed that ThunderCats was going to be part of a trilogy, such as this Pete and Ace's review of the game. But sadly, after speaking to the head of Elite Systems, Steve Wilcox, I can reveal this was never the case. Only one ThunderCats game was ever meant to be published. So, the big question now is, whatever happened to the other 2 ThunderCats games? Were they cancelled the moment Faster Than Light's ThunderCats was released, and therefore destined to forever delve in the world of gaming urban legend? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Both of them actually were released. Paradise Software's adaptation had a bit of tinkering done to it and was released 9 months later as Beyond the Ice Palace. As you can see, Beyond the Ice Palace retains a lot of the elements you'd expect from a ThunderCats game. The main character even looks like Lion-O still, just with blonde hair and sunglasses. The levels themselves are still passable as locations within the ThunderCats universe, with the final level looking very much like a possible Mum-Ra's pyramid. Even the final boss looks like Mum-Ra still. Or at least his mother, in the right light. The game itself is also a lot more fun to play than The Lost Eye of Thundera, with 8-way scrolling giving it a more console platformy feeling to it. In fact, the only real thing against this game is that aside from its infuriating lift segment, which pushes you into homing enemies off screen, is that it's a bit on the easy side, and if you know where you're going in the maze-like levels, it can be finished in less than 12 minutes, even less if you're avoiding enemies. As a side note, Beyond the Ice Palace has an interesting story of its own. After the ThunderCats license was removed, Elite decided to change a few of the sprites around for this game too, and then pitch it to Capcom as a potential sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, entitled Ghosts and Goblins Beyond the Ice Palace. The Ice Palace referring to the Ice Palace level in Ghosts and Goblins, obviously, hence Beyond the Ice Palace. However, as we all know by now, Capcom already had a sequel to Ghosts and Goblins in development, Ghouls and Ghosts, so rejected Beyond the Ice Palace. So Elite simply reverted a lot of the graphics to an earlier build, hence why the main character looks a lot more like Lion-O than Sir Arthur, and dropped the Ghouls and Ghosts name entirely, just retaining the subtitle of Beyond the Ice Palace. So in hindsight, if you ultimately judged these events on magazine scores at the time, it probably turned out for the best. Despite it only being released a mere 9 months after ThunderCats, the press were far more harsh on Beyond the Ice Palace, with most of them giving the game much lower scores. Such as Ace again, returning with their idiotic scoring system to give the game 648 out of 1,000 for the Amstrad version. And so we come to that third ThunderCats game developed in-house at Elite. Unfortunately, most of those involved only have a fleeting memory of the development, so I sadly cannot say that any of the following is conclusive. But all research I have done, as well as others over the years, has all pointed out to the fact that the third game is actually Bombjack 2. Obviously at first glance, this does sound completely absurd, but the clues to this lie in the Commodore 64 version of the game. For starters, have a listen to the in-game music. That's without a doubt the ThunderCats theme tune, or at least the best a SID chip could emulate. Of course you could say that using copyrighted music was pretty common in games at the time. Even Elite themselves used Jean-Michel Jarre's Magnetic Fields Part 2 in the original Bombjack for the Commodore 64, but Elite's own audio programmer Martin Cooksey has gone on record to say that the ThunderCats theme was used in Bombjack 2 to save time, so it could be interpreted as him saying it was left in rather than placed on to Bombjack 2. The other indicators are the fact that the main character, as small as he is, looks far more like Lion-O with his orangey red hair and blue leotard than Bombjack ever did to his original counterpart, as you can see in his comparison shot here. And for a game called Bombjack, and totally unlike the original, you don't actually collect bombs in the game whatsoever. Also, not to forget, Steve Wilcox had already pitched the other ThunderCats game as a sequel to an arcade game they had previously ported. So why not pitch the other ThunderCats game to Tecmo? But it just happens that this time around they were more successful at the pitch, as it was accepted. Amstrad and Spectrum ports developed later are noticeably less ThunderCatsy, what with their new Stonehenge, Taj Mahal backgrounds, compared to the C64's 3D-ish giant sandpit and in space versions. But these were developed after the Commodore 64 version, so could be regarded as games intended to be Bombjack 2 from the ground up, as a decision had already been made by then. Magazines at the time also noticed how far removed Bombjack 2 was from the original and rated it accordingly. Ace magazine had revised their idiotic scoring system with the even more stupid rating of 2 pint glasses out of 5. Then re-reviewed it 2 months later, giving it 4 pints out of 5, with no explanation for the extra 2 pints whatsoever. How the exact same game can improve by 2 pints in 61 days is beyond me. I wish I was making it up. Again, we never will have conclusive evidence until a ROM of the original game does ever show up, and since it's been over a quarter of a century already, looks increasingly unlikely. But everything else does point to the fact that Bombjack 2 was originally the third ThunderCats game. So, that reason as to why there was no NES ThunderCats game ever released. Well, in actual fact, there was one in development, but it was being produced not by LGN as you'd expect, but by Elite again. Elite did publish a number of NES games, well, 2. The arcade port of Joe and Mac, as well as the dubious honour of publishing the much-loved Angry Reviewer staple that is Dragon's Lair in Europe. But issue 2 of the Games Machine stated in their review of ThunderCats that Elite were promising a Nintendo version shortly, as well as Elite themselves advertising that a Nintendo version was coming out. No other Nintendo consoles or handhelds existed in 1987, so it was implying the NES. So given the context, it would have been a port of The Lost Eye of Thundera, and also given the closest specs on an architectural level, it would have been most similar to the Commodore 64 version, which you're currently watching. Obviously the NES was far better at handling sprites, backgrounds, scrolling, and arguably music than the Commodore 64, and on top of that, it would have been more polished overall given the longer development time. But it does give you an indication of what might have been. So there you have it. The story of the ThunderCats game that was never meant to be, but was. 2 ThunderCats games that were meant to be, but weren't. And the fate of the NES port with the strange resolution of one of the 80s greatest franchises never receiving a console port. In fact, it wouldn't be for another 25 years before the franchise saw any kind of game at all, with 2012's Nintendo DS game, which was also a load of old crap, scoring just 1 out of 10 in Destructoid's review. So, what other 80s Saturday morning cartoon shows were adapted into video games here that you may not know even exist, I hear you ask? Well, that, my friends, is for another episode. Don't forget to click on that subscribe button below and be first to see gaming videos and features such as this. And why not check out some of my other features below as well? But thanks for watching, peoples!